Good morning, guys. Welcome back to SMB Designs. If you're new here, welcome. Please consider hitting that like button and subscribe and leave me a comment. That would be awesome. We're going to be picking up this week in the book of Enoch, and we are in, let me see what chapter we're actually in. This was a long chapter. We're in chapter 89. All right, we're going to pick up in verse 46. And it went to it and spoke to it alone, and raised it to being a ram, and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. But during all these things, these dogs oppressed the sheep. And the first ram pursued the second ram, and the second ram arose and fled before it. And I saw until those dogs pulled down the first ram. And that second ram arose and led the little sheep. And those sheep grew and multiplied. But all the dogs and foxes and wild boars feared and fled before it. And that ram butted and killed the wild beast. And those wild beasts had no longer any power among the sheep, and robbed them no more of anything. And that ram fathered many sheep and fell asleep, and a little sheep became ram in its place, and became prince and leader of those sheep. And that house became great and broad, and it was built for those sheep, and a high and great tower was built on the house for the Lord of the sheep, and that house was low. But the tower was elevated and high, and the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they offered a full table before him. And again I saw those sheep that they again erred and went many ways, and forsook that their house. And the Lord of the sheep called some from among the sheep, and sent them to the sheep. But the sheep began to slay them. And one of them was saved and was not slain, and it sped away and cried aloud over the sheep, and they sought to slay it. But the Lord of the sheep saved it from the sheep, and brought it up to me, and caused it to live there. And many other sheep he sent to those sheep to testify to them and lament over them. And after that I saw that when they forsook the house of the Lord and his tower, they fell away entirely, and their eyes were blinded. And I saw the Lord of the sheep, how he worked much slaughter among them in their herds, until those sheep invited that slaughter and betrayed his place. And he gave them over into the hands of the lions and tigers and wolves and hyenas, and into the hands of the foxes, and to all the wild beasts, and those wild beasts began to tear in pieces those sheep. And I saw that he forsook their house and their tower, and gave them all into the hand of the lion to tear them and devour them, into the hand of all the wild beasts. And I began to cry aloud with all my power, and to appeal to the Lord of the sheep, because the sheep were being devoured by all the wild beasts. But he remained unmoved, though he saw it, and rejoiced that they were devoured, and swallowed and robbed, and left them to be devoured in the hand of all the beasts. And he called 70 shepherds, and gave those sheep to them, that they might pasture them. And he spoke to the shepherds and their companions, Let each individual of you pasture the sheep from now on, and everything that I shall command you, that do you. And I will deliver them over to you duly numbered, and tell you which of them are to be destroyed, and them you will destroy. And he gave over to them those sheep. And he called another and spoke to him, Observe, and mark everything that the shepherds will do to those sheep, for they will destroy more of them than I have commanded them. And every excess and the destruction which will be done through the shepherds, record how many they destroy according to my command, and how many according to their own caprice. Record against every individual shepherd all the destruction he effects, and read out before me by number how many they destroy and how many they deliver over for destruction, that I may have this as a testimony against them, and know every deed of the shepherds, that I may comprehend and see what they do, whether or not they abide by my command which I have commanded them. But they shall not know it, and you shall not declare it to them, nor admonish them, but only record against each individual all the destruction which the shepherds effect, each in his name, each in his time, and lay it all before me. And I saw until those shepherds pastured in their season, and they began to slay and destroy more than they were bidden. And they delivered those sheep into the hands of the lions. And the lions and tigers ate and devoured the greater part of those sheep, and the wild boars ate along with them. And they burned that tower and demolished that house. And I became very sorrowful over that tower, because that house of the sheep was demolished. And afterwards I was unable to see if those sheep entered that house. And the shepherds and their associates delivered over those sheep to all the wild beasts to devour them, and each one of them received in his time a definite number. It was written by the other in a book how many each one of them destroyed of them. And each one slew and destroyed many more than was prescribed. And I began to weep and lament on account of those sheep. And thus, in the vision, I saw that one who wrote, how he wrote down every one that was destroyed by those shepherds day by day, and carried up and laid down and showed actually the whole book to the Lord of the sheep, everything that they had done, and all that each one of them had made away with, and all that they had given over to destruction. And the book was read before the Lord of the sheep, and he took the book from his hand, and read it, and sealed it, and laid it down. And I saw how the shepherds pastured for 12 hours, and behold, 3 of those sheep turned back and came and entered and began to build up all that had fallen down of that house. But the wild boars tried to hinder them, but they were not able. And they began again to build as before, and they raised up that tower, and it was named the High Tower. And they began again to place a table before the tower, but all the bread on it was polluted and not pure. And as touching all this, the eyes of those sheep were blinded, so that they saw not, and the eye of their shepherd likewise were blinded, and they delivered them in large numbers to their shepherds for destruction, and they trampled the sheep with their feet and devoured them. And the Lord of the sheep remained unmoved until all the sheep were dispersed over the field and mingled with the beast, and the shepherds did not save them out of the hand of the beast. And this one who wrote the book carried it up, and showed it and read it before the Lord of the sheep, and implored him on their account, and besought him on their account as he showed him all the doings of the shepherds, and gave testimony before him against all the shepherds. And he took the actual book and laid it down beside him. And chapter 90. And I saw until that in this manner 35 shepherds undertook the pasturing of the sheep, and they completed their periods as did the first, and others received them into their hands, to pasture them for their period, each shepherd in his own period. And after that I saw in my vision all the birds of heaven coming, the angels, the vultures, the kites, the ravens, but the eagles led all the birds, and they began to devour those sheep, and to pick out their eyes, and to devour their flesh. And the sheep cried out because their flesh was being devoured by the birds. And as for me, I looked and lamented in my sleep over that shepherd who pastured the sheep. And I saw until those sheep were devoured by the dogs and eagles and kites, and they left neither flesh nor skin nor sinew remaining on them until only their bones stood there. And their bones too fell to the earth, and the sheep became few. And I saw until the 23rd had undertaken the pasturing and completed in their many periods 58 times. But behold, lambs were born by those white sheep, and they began to open their eyes and to see and to cry to the sheep. They cried to them, but they did not hearken to what they said to them, but were very deaf, and their eyes were very blinded. And I saw in the vision how the ravens flew on those lambs, and took one of those lambs, and dashed the sheep in pieces, and devoured them. And I saw until horns grew on those lambs, and the ravens cast down their horns. And I saw until there sprouted a great horn of one of those sheep, and their eyes were opened. And it looked at them, and their eyes opened, and it cried to the sheep, and the rams saw it, and all ran to it. And notwithstanding all this, those eagles and vultures and ravens and kites kept on tearing the sheep, and swooping down on them, and devouring them until the sheep remained silent. But the rams lamented and cried out. And those ravens fought and battled with it, and sought to lay low its horn. But they had no power over it. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites were gathered together. And there came with them all the sheep of the field. They all came together and helped each other to break that horn of the ram. And I saw that man who wrote down the names of the shepherds and brought them up before the Lord of the sheep, came, and he helped that ram and showed it everything. Its help was coming down. And I looked until that Lord of the sheep came to them angry. All those who saw him ran, and they all fell into the shadow in front of him. All the eagles and vultures and ravens and kites gathered together and brought with them all the wild sheep, and they all came together and helped one another in order to dash that horn of the ram in pieces. And I looked at that man who wrote the book at the command of the Lord, until he opened that book of the destruction that those last 12 shepherds had done. And he showed in front of the Lord of the sheep that they had destroyed even more than those before them had. And I looked, and the Lord of the sheep came to them, and took the staff of his anger, and struck the earth. And the earth was split, and all the animals and the birds of the sky fell from those sheep, and sank in the earth, and it closed over them. And I saw until a great sword was given to the sheep, and the sheep proceeded against all the beasts of the field to slay them, and all the beasts and the birds of the heaven flew before their face. And I saw that man who wrote the book according to the command of the Lord, until he opened that book concerning the destruction which those 12 last shepherds had wrought, and showed that they had destroyed much more than their predecessors before the Lord of the sheep. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep came to them, and took in his hand the staff of his wrath, and smote the earth. And the earth clave asunder, and all the beasts and all the birds of heaven fell from among those sheep, and were swallowed up in the earth, and it covered them. And I saw until a throne was erected in the pleasant land, and the Lord of the sheep sat himself on it. And the other took the sealed book, and opened those books before the Lord of the sheep. And the Lord called those men, the 7 first white ones, and commanded that they should bring before him, beginning with the first star which led the way, all the stars whose private members were like those of horses, and they brought them all before him. And he said to that man who wrote before him, being one of those 7 white ones, and said to him, take those 70 shepherds to whom I delivered the sheep, and who, taking them on their own authority, slew more than I commanded them. And behold, they were all bound. I saw, and they all stood before him. And the judgment was held first over the stars, and they were judged and found guilty, and went to the place of condemnation. And they were cast into an abyss, full of fire and flaming, and full of pillars of fire. And those 70 shepherds were judged and found guilty, and they were cast into that fiery abyss. And I saw at that time how a like abyss was opened in the midst of the earth, full of fire. And they brought those blinded sheep, and they were all judged and found guilty, and cast into this fiery abyss. And they burned. Now this abyss was to the right of that house. And I saw those sheep burning, and their bones burning. And I stood up to see until they folded up that old house, and carried off all the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of the house were at the same time folded up with it. And they carried it off, and laid it in a place in the south of the land. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house greater and loftier than that first, and set it up in the place of the first which had been folded up. All its pillars were new, and its ornaments were new and larger than those on the first, the old one which he had taken away, and all the sheep were within it. Side verse here, Hebrews 13:14, says, for here have we no continuing city, but we seek one to come. Picking back up in verse 30, and I saw all the sheep which had been left, and all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of heaven, falling down and doing homage to those sheep, and making petition to and obeying them in everything. And thereafter, those three who were clothed in white and had seized me by my hand, who had taken me up before, and the hand of that ram also seizing hold of me, they took me up and set me down in the midst of those sheep before the judgment took place. And those sheep were all white, and their wool was abundant and clean. And all that had been destroyed and dispersed, and all the beasts of the field, and all the birds of heaven, assembled in that house. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced with great joy, because they were all good and had returned to his house. And I saw until they laid down that sword which had been given to the sheep, and they brought it back into the house. And it was sealed before the presence of the Lord. And all the sheep were invited into that house, but it held them not. And the eyes of them all were opened, and they saw the good, and there was not one among them that did not see. And I saw that the house was large and broad and very full. And I saw that a white bull was born with large horns, and all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the air feared him, and made petition to him all the time. And I saw until all their generations were transformed, and they all became white bulls, and the first among them became a lamb. And that lamb became a great animal, and had great black horns on its head. And the Lord of the sheep rejoiced over it, and over all the oxen. And I slept in their midst, and I awoke and saw everything. This is the vision which I saw while I slept. And I awoke and blessed the Lord of righteousness, and gave him glory. Then I wept greatly, and my tears ceased not, until I could no longer endure it. When I saw, they flowed on account of what I had seen. For everything shall come and be fulfilled, and all the deeds of men in their order were shown to me. On that night I remembered the first dream, and because of it I wept and was troubled, because I had seen that vision. Okay, that is the last verse of this chapter. So we will pick up next week, beginning in chapter 91. I hope this has blessed you and that you have a great week. If you have any prayer requests, feel free to leave them in the comments below or to email me. My email is in the description box for you.